So what we tried to do with systemic, exactly as was so well put by Sirpa, the Club of Rome has been looking at systems approaches to issues, global challenges for the last 50 years. And we believe now that we are in the greatest global moment ever to apply systems change thinking. This is the time in human history where we have a tightly coupled human social ecological system of planetary scope. And we heard about the planetary boundaries on your last wake-up call from Johan Rockström, working directly also with Potsdam. We're trying to see with other collaborators how we tap into interconnected and interdependent system where we are all completely linked and part of the value chain. And that means that our individual and collective responsibility has enormously increased. Next slide, please. So if you try to look at what is the wake-up call this morning, what is the wake-up call for the future that we want? So you're going to have to click quite fast, Roland-Jan. First, we are at a tipping point for the climate and biodiversity and health convergence, and we are leaving the safe operating space. We need a dire economic reset. Economies in lockdown and governments are releasing the biggest stimulus packages, and you in the European Parliament are right now talking about the recovery funds. Next, we need to ensure that multilateralism is once again resurrected. We need to work with the US and China in different ways. And of course, with the Biden administration, we are now offered the opportunity, in particular also in the area of climate, to do so. We know that there's a renewed activism within the youth, within people of different color, those who feel that they've been socially disenfranchised, and that it is time to work with them to bring them into the fold of solutions and make them a part of the future. Next. And there's a paradigm change in European politics itself. And I often model political parity. It is the first time that we have a card-carrying conservative in the European Commission who has embraced the green and social values of Europe collectively and worked across the different parties with her different vice presidents to ensure that the North Star of the European Union is the European Green Deal. Next slide. So if we go into what does that European Green Deal mean? What does it signify? It's very important to remember the following. First of all, we need to move into, next slide, please. So rolling on, you're going to have to, there we go, a new growth strategy, acknowledging that environmental and economic goals are not in contradiction, and that future economic development depends on how we preserve and protect our natural capital and our human capital. Next. That we have special attention which is given to those social considerations of the transition, because we all know that the just transition has to be part of a European Green Deal. Next. If we look at President von der Leyen's State of the Union speech, it is clearly giving an indication of several very important points for our compass, what we've tried to do with systemic. This is the opportunity to make change happen by design. We need to design our way out of the mess that we've created. We need to create opportunities for the world of tomorrow. And we need to propel Europe forward through the European Green Deal, which is our blueprint to make that transformation. That means systemic modernization across our economy, society, and industry. And I'm pleased that actually President von der Leyen had a copy of our compass before she wrote the State of the Union, and also several of our books, including The Limits to Growth and Come On and other publications of the Club of Rome, to stimulate some of her thinking, which also very much spoke of limiting the model that we value wealth on into a much more well-being oriented economy. Very important that the leadership is not about self-serving propaganda, but moving much more now from wealth to well-being, out of a growth paradigm into new indicators. Next slide, please. So the objective of the report was, first of all, to think holistically about the European Green Deal, to bring in a systems approach, to have a conversation with the European Commission and the European institutions to make sure that the European Green Deal is combined with the recovery. We are the authors, the Club of Rome, with Systemic, Janusz Potocnik being one of the key authors, former commissioner for the environment and also research and innovation. And we had a series of different contributors, including members of the Club of Rome and other organizations. What were the 5 core questions for our report? First, will the EGD achieve its goals as it stands today? Second, if not, what systemic conditions need to be put in place to change that? Third, what interventions are needed to put these conditions into place? Fourth, what are the economic ecosystems that will meet our societal needs in the spirit of the European Green Deal? And fifth, what are the industrial champions? So we've moved our thinking from a systems approach of principles, if you go into the next slide, into also what are the key champions. The ambition of the European Green Deal is very high, and we know that, and we know that we're already starting to wake up the dinosaurs. Look at what's just happened with the Common Agricultural Policy. Look at right now what's happening with regard to the recovery, and look at also what's happening with the taxonomy discussions. If you look at the key points that we need to think about, Roland-Jan, there you go. First of all, it sets a zero net emissions, a 2050 target of decoupling growth and resource use. That is essential. It acknowledges the need for fair and just transition, which means that we need to bring people on the journey right now. And it aims at strongly interlinked and mutually reinforcing policy recommendations. But the implementation is uncertain, and we're already seeing the conflicts between some of the DGs. First of all, we don't address the drivers and the pressures that cause environmental change, but also that have an impact on our policy. It does not offer a systemic perspective. How do we optimize the different policies? How do we ensure that they are interlinked and working together? And now, of course, with COVID, we have to think about the COVID-19 recovery and the economic ramifications that we will be facing post-COVID. Next. So the systems change compass guides action on all levels of this system. It maps and envisages the system in service of people and planet. It looks at a system level orientation towards a desired state. Next. And it charts pathways towards prosperity and well-being well within the planetary boundaries. So let's start with why exactly we have done this and what the core premise of this is. And this comes back to limits to growth. Core factors in well-being, our economic development, is natural resources and environmental sinks. The report is therefore based on a natural resource optic. The way we treat natural resources to a large extent determines the economic results and clearly environmental and health impacts. And we can look at the fact that COVID is a zoonotic disease. That's clear proof of this. And as Dana Meadows said already 50 years ago, we will never just have one singular crisis. We will have a series of different crises. So climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, health implications, but now also all of the other potential crises that will be trigger-on effects from these. Next slide. So the system change approach is one that's fundamentally based on this natural resource approach. And it is related to a certain degree to the SDGs and the Paris Climate Agreement, but it does not necessarily address all the systems changes that we see within the SDGs. Next. It is still an important contribution to their implementation. And what we're trying to do is look at how we can interrelate the SDGs, the Paris Climate Agreement within the compass in order to ensure implementation. That is the key, ensuring implementation of sustainable consumption and production. So if we look at the natural resource impacts, and if we look at the driver's pressure state impact response that was set up by the DPCSIR framework, next, we look at the way in which the state and the impacts are fully interrelated and where we need to go in order to address these impacts. We need to look at the response, next, and the drivers, which are clearly population growth and consumption, next. And we need to look at how the food system and the different types of systems are interrelated, energy system, our resources system, and having an impact. So what is our response? Next. Our response has to be policies that work for our economy, policies that support the underbilling of the economy and also the financial system working in sync. Next slide. So we're going to translate the system change compass into systemic orientation. I'm now going to go very quickly through these slides because unfortunately it's the best way to show you, and I wish that I could do it myself because poor Roland-Jan, you're going to get a cramp in your finger. But the system change compass has 10 principles. And to apply these 10 principles, we've looked at systemic orientations. So if you move next, you will see that first we have the 30 system level orientation, which we will go through. The next is the way in which we look at 3 to 5 ecosystem level orientations for each of those key principles and system level orientations, and then how we start to look at champions. What are those industrial champions that are going to enable us to decouple our economy from growth and from natural resource use? Next. And so these next slides, in terms of the principles, I'm just going to ask you, Roland-Jan, to go quite quickly. We have 10. Redefining prosperity. Number 2, redefining natural resource use. Number 3, redefining progress. Number 4, redefining metrics and ensuring that we perform metrics the proper way. Redefining competitiveness. Next, redefining incentives. 7, redefining consumption from owning to using. 8, redefining finance, the facilitator of the transition. 9, redefining governance, systemic approach to governance influenced by science, so science-driven governance. And then most importantly, redefining leadership, because we know that we need the political will. And now I'm going to go quite quickly through each of those, because if you look at the principles and these now 30 system level applications, so we have 3 system level interventions for each of the compass orientation. If we look at redefining prosperity, we need to look at number 1, next, embrace fairness for real prosperity. That means wealth creation needs to go to income and wealth distribution. We need to look at the conditions for social acceptance of the necessary transition, absorb full costs introduced through all economic ecosystems. Next, income-based taxes with resource-based taxes. We need to look at addressing the shift from labor taxation to resource taxation and product taxation. Next, if we look at redefining natural resource use, we have to look at the complement of energy and greenhouse gas related targets by introducing science-based resource use absolute decoupling targets, moving through dematerialization all the way through to energy efficient decarbonization impacts. And then ensuring that, again, we put in place the legal and the financial systems with circular and carbon-free principles and support the necessary infrastructure, research, and innovation to really ensure a carbon-free circular transition. Next, redefining progress. What does that look like? Meeting the societal needs is the purpose of a model based on economic systems. Societal needs inside safe operating space. Again, the planetary boundaries. Ensuring that we put in place not short-term based governance-driven decision-making, but longer-term strategic approaches and incentives like the European Green Deal. Reorganize the European institutions, the governments and other governing bodies much more into this type of approach where we promote moving out of silos into systems. Next. And that will obviously optimize the way in which we put together the metrics, because we have to redefine the metrics, but we have to look at how the metrics are interconnected. Replace GDP as the sole indicator. Start moving into social and environmental values. Look at natural capital accounting and introduce clearly standardized company and investor reporting and make that not just voluntary, but make that clearly much more regulatory based. Redefining competitiveness then will come into that in terms of how we actually look at our resources, our energy, and our productivity, how the full value chain. And what's interesting here, if you look at the next 2 points, is that we're seeing already that ESG reporting is clearly actually enabling companies to get out of the pandemic much faster because they've already de-risked their value chain. They've already looked at the importance of the full value chain. But we need to also, when we think about digitalization, which is part of this optimization perspective, that digitalization is going to really be based on energy reducing models, that digitalization is also going to be optimized for people. Next. And we have providing jobs, trying to be as global as we develop, obviously, local retraining, reskilling jobs and new educational opportunities. Next. What are the key incentives that are going to enable us to get to where we need to go? We clearly have to do a costing of externalities, include all costs related to environmental and health impacts. This will introduce the real value of social and natural capital. Next. That means we need to do it without further delay. All harmful and unsustainable subsidies must get eliminated. That means perverse energy, perverse common agricultural policy subsidies, which we know are propping up the old system, and prioritize investment in rebooting nature and updating environmental standards. And my worry here is seeing what's happening right now at the European level with regard to the taxonomy and also with regard to the common agricultural policy proposals. That means we need to move into also what does that mean for the consumer? Because we can't just work at the business level or at the policy level. We have to educate consumers and we have to empower them to make informed choices. Next, we have to explore, obviously, the opportunities that are offered by a less ownership biased model, which we know the young generation is already embracing, and provide consumers with alternatives. And we need to move to a very different producer ownership business model. We already see IKEA and many of our companies that are shifting into a much more services-oriented or rented-oriented model. Next. But we still, as we do a shift within our economies, need to think about how we redefine finance. This is a facilitator of transition. And that means we need to ensure financial accounting and risk assessment. We need to make sure that all public investments catalyze system change and have environmental and social values embedded. Again, this is a red flag for our current recovery discussions. Next slide. And we have to support and de-risk private investment and expanded finance. We are already seeing a huge shift within the European Investment Bank. We're seeing changes within our central. We need to make sure that we link up the shift within the public banks and also the private sector. Next. Once we have done all of that, we need to ensure that we redefine governance. That means that we sharing sovereignty and working together. That means solidarity as much as it means a sovereign, strong European region. So we have to support inclusive, informed, and fair participatory governance systems and move into a very different ownership model. That might mean more citizen assemblies. And we're already seeing that many of our member states, towns, and cities are organizing citizen assemblies. We have to explore the establishment of an international management convention and the inclusion of resource management in all existing international agreements. And we need to ensure that we lead on the implementation of more innovative, deliberative formats for policymaking, including the way in which we look at development funds and look at what's happening right now in the UK, where they're now actually pulling out of development aid as things get more and more difficult domestically. And this cannot be the situation as we move forward, because we are as vulnerable as the most vulnerable link in the value chain. Next slide. To redefine leadership, that means building trust and ensure science-informed policymaking. And again, I have a red flag in what's happening in terms of the taxonomy right now, which was science-informed and now has been watered down in terms of the new delegated acts based on sectoral intervention and lobbying. Next slide. We need to empower and support system change leaders at all levels. Next slide. And we need to ensure that the rights of future generations are protected and integrated into our policymaking. So if we move into the conclusion, If we look at our 10 principles, which we put forward, where we have to redefine prosperity, finance, etc., we look then at what does that mean specifically in terms of next, the actual 3 to 5 ecosystem level orientations. We can now move quickly into what that means with regard to developing the champions. So next, if we look at the related ecosystem links to our resource intensive human needs, we have to talk about nutrition. Next, we have to talk about housing. Next, we have to talk about mobility. Next, and we have to talk about daily functional needs. These are our essentials. And coming out of COVID, we know that these are principal essentials for our well-being. Next, but what actually underpins, what supports the fulfillment of that well-being, of those human needs? Next, we need to look at nature-based solutions. Next, we need to look at energy and how our energy shifts, circular materials, and then finally, we need to make sure that information and processing is both optimized, but also, again, related to people, planet, and prosperity. Next. So what does this look like now? We've got 50 possible champions and orientations based on that assessment. Next. These are the 50 nascent industrial champions that we're looking at. And I'm going to go very quickly, so Roland-Jan, you can start clicking. Healthy food, built environment, intermodal mobility, and consumer goods. These underneath are all of the key areas that we've been looking at in terms of those first 4 major important resources for people. And then secondly, the underpinning impacts, nature-based energy, circular materials, information, and processing. If we take all of that and we go into the next slide, you will see a new systems map to envision the system and its different parts. So if you look at the circle around, that is our system guided by the compass. Then we have 8 economic ecosystems, which I indicated for you just now with regard to mobility, nutrition, etc. Next. Then you look at the interrelationship with all of the different champions and the opportunities that we actually have to really start to steer our investment in those areas. Next. It's very important to look at that application, and I will give you just a final quick peek of how it works. So if you take our principles, you then translate each of these different principles into key ecosystem thinking. You then move into next, how does that apply in terms of the underpinning needs of society? Next, if we take intermodal mobility, which we know that we all need, next, and you start to look at that economic ecosystem for mobility, and this is very small, but you'll see how we start to map it out and create an actual implementation table, and then next. And that will mean that we have key areas that are champions where we know we have to focus our investment for intermodal mobility. Next. And then we need to ensure that we have the right policy support to enable that to actually happen. So regulation, funding support, other and market signals in order to ensure that we move forward in an intermobility type of policy. Next. So looking at the policy conclusions, we have to define a desired target societal outcomes. We need to look at the work of the European in line with this. If we look at the next point, which is so important, bring a whole of government approach. Ensure that we bring all of the institutions together, but also within the European Commission, the European Parliament, more dialogue, more discussion, more cross-fertilization between the different departments and the different themes. Next. We have to pressure test our implementation policy measures to ensure that they drive the drivers and the pressures in the way in which we actually want them to go, as identified in the compass. These are not merely just looking at the systems or the symptoms, but also looking at the solutions. And across all levels of the system, consider political orientations. Already start to understand political tensions that exist so that we can ensure that we actually bring policy into a discussion that is much more constructive from the outset. Next. And at champion level, consider how best to create the market conditions and the direct funding support, in particular now through our coronavirus recovery money, to ensure that we don't go back to business as usual, but that we actually do build back better. Next slide. Next. So this is my concluding slide. We know that the European Green Deal and the post-COVID recovery are two sides of the same coin, but we need to make sure that we are more convincing in the way in which right now we make our decisions. The economic policy designed by the European Green Deal, if we implement it properly, is a competitiveness policy. It will enable us to build resilience against future shocks. It will also allow us to provide how we reconsider globalization effects, how we look at the value chain and the most vulnerable parts of that value chain. It's also a call for intergenerational solidarity and agreement. And we know that coming out of COVID, we have to tap into that consciousness of people ready to actually change. Most citizens surveyed across Europe do not want to go back to business as usual. Next. COVID-19 is providing the necessary missing urgency to the European Green Deal and to climate-related financial efforts. Next. And both of them, their related challenges require a new approach to governance, in particular on the global level, but also now as we're seeing some of the tensions and unpacking those tensions within some of the policies that are before us today at the European level. Next slide. So that was a quick whirlwind tour through the compass